Nicole thought she had found love, Ryan believed he had found control, and little Lily, only 4 years old, was caught in the middle of a nightmare that no one saw coming. It began in a quiet suburban town where little ever happened, the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked and children rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. The neighborhood had its routines, its familiar faces, and its quiet assumptions that everyone was doing just fine behind closed doors. Among those families was a young mother named Nicole and her 4-year-old daughter, Lily. To outsiders, their lives looked ordinary. Nicole was often seen walking hand in hand with Lily to the corner store, or pushing her daughter on the swing at the park. Nicole was only 23. Still figuring out adulthood, but she seemed determined to provide her daughter with stability. What no one realized was how fragile that stability really was. Nicole had been restless for a long time. She was lonely, isolated, and overwhelmed by the responsibility of raising a child on her own. When she met Ryan, a teenager only 17 years old, she thought she had finally found someone who would fill the emptiness. He was younger, yes, but he made her feel wanted. Ryan wasn't known for kindness or patience. His reputation around town leaned more toward troublemaker than protector, but Nicole ignored the warnings. She told herself people just didn't understand him the way she did. She was convinced that he cared for her in ways no one else ever had, and in her loneliness, that was enough. At first, their relationship seemed harmless. Ryan hung around Nicole's apartment, helping himself to snacks and video games, acting like he belonged there. He charmed Nicole with big promises about their future together. But from the start, his presence unsettled Lily. She was too young to put words to it, but she clung to her mother more tightly whenever Ryan was around. Her once bubbly laugh grew quieter. She spent less time in the living room and more time retreating to her room, clutching her stuffed rabbit. The changes were subtle, easy for Nicole to dismiss, but they were signs of something growing darker. Ryan began to stay over more frequently, practically living in the small apartment. Nicole told herself it was convenient that he could help with Lily, that maybe this would make her little family feel more complete. But instead of stepping up, Ryan took control. He complained when Lily made noise, rolled his eyes when she asked for attention, and made cruel remarks when Nicole wasn't looking. There were moments when Nicole noticed the harshness in his tone, the way he looked at her daughter with annoyance rather than affection. Still, she brushed it off, convincing herself that he would warm up eventually. Outside, the town carried on unaware. Neighbors waved at Nicole without knowing she was hiding stress behind her forced smile. Teachers at Lily's daycare thought she was simply shy when she stopped raising her hand or drawing pictures to show off. Even Nicole's closest friends didn't realize how much influence Ryan already had inside that apartment. The walls of their home, once filled with the sounds of cartoons and Lily's chatter, now echoed with tension and unease. What no one could see was how quickly the balance of power was shifting. Nicole wasn't just falling for Ryan, she was surrendering to him. Every decision, every choice began to revolve around his moods. And as he tightened his grip on her, Lily was being pushed further into the shadows, her small voice drowned out by the storm building in her own home. Ryan's presence in Nicole's apartment became the new normal far quicker than anyone had expected. What started as occasional overnight stays turned into him claiming space that was never his to begin with. His shoes by the door, his jacket tossed on the couch, his demands shaping the rhythms of the household. Nicole, desperate for love and attention, allowed it to happen without resistance. She told herself that this was what families did: they adjusted, they compromised. But in reality, she wasn't building a family. She was surrendering her home to someone who saw both her and her daughter as possessions to control. Lily noticed the change before anyone else. She had always been a lively little girl, the kind who drew colorful crayon pictures to tape proudly on the fridge, the kind who laughed so hard at cartoons that her giggles carried through the walls. But with Ryan around, her spirit began to fade. She stopped rushing to the door when her mother came home, stopped waving to neighbors from the balcony, stopped skipping down the sidewalk with her usual joy. Instead, she became quiet, withdrawn, watchful. She learned quickly that any noise or mess might trigger Ryan's irritation. It was as if the safe space she once knew had shrunk smaller and smaller until even her own bedroom didn't feel entirely her own. The bruises started small, a mark on her arm, a scrape on her leg that didn't quite match the story Nicole gave. At daycare, when teachers asked gently what had happened, Lily lowered her eyes and mumbled something about falling. Nicole, when questioned, smiled too quickly and brushed it off with vague excuses. Accidents, she insisted, kids fall all the time. The teachers, uneasy but unable to prove otherwise, let it go. Each missed opportunity to dig deeper allowed the truth to hide in plain sight. Friends noticed that Nicole was harder to reach. Phone calls went unanswered, invitations declined. When she did appear at gatherings, Ryan was always close by, hovering like a shadow. He interrupted her, spoke for her, and made sure she knew when he disapproved. Nicole laughed nervously through it all, as though it was harmless, but the control was tightening. What once looked like youthful infatuation had twisted into something far more dangerous. Neighbors sometimes overheard shouting through the walls, sharp bursts of anger that ended just as quickly as they began. They shrugged it off, convincing themselves it was normal for young couples to argue. After all, who wanted to intrude, but those walls carried secrets, slammed doors, harsh words. The sound of a frightened child retreating to her room. Ryan didn't see Lily as a child who needed love and care. To him, she was an obstacle, a reminder that Nicole's attention could never belong fully to him. Every time Lily cried for her mother, every time she tugged at Nicole's sleeve for comfort, Ryan's resentment deepened. And Nicole, caught in her own need for affection, failed to recognize the danger in his growing hostility. The red flags were everywhere, waving boldly for anyone who cared to look closely. But each one was ignored, dismissed, or explained away. What appeared to outsiders as small quirks of a rocky relationship were in fact signs of a situation spiraling toward disaster. Lily's silence was the loudest warning of all, and yet her voice, fragile and small, was lost in the noise of denial that filled the household. The night that everything changed began like so many others. The air outside was heavy with summer humidity, the kind that made the walls feel closer and the air harder to breathe. Inside the small apartment, the glow of the television flickered across the living room while Nicole scrolled absent-mindedly through her phone. Ryan was restless, pacing, muttering under his breath, his temper simmering just beneath the surface. Lily, dressed in her favorite pink pajamas with little stars on them, had already been put 2 bed hours earlier. But sleep didn't come easily anymore. She often woke in the middle of the night, clutching her stuffed rabbit, too unsettled to drift off again. That night was no different. She padded quietly into the living room, rubbing her eyes and asking softly for a drink of water. To anyone else, it would have been an innocent, ordinary request from a child. To Ryan, it was a spark to ignite the fury he had been holding back all day. The sound of her small voice seemed to enrage him, and in an instant his anger turned violent. What followed was swift, brutal, and irreversible. Nicole froze where she sat. Her instincts should have been to run, to protect, to pull her daughter into her arms, but fear rooted her in place. It wasn't just fear of Ryan's fists, it was the fear of losing him, the fear of standing alone again, the fear of what would happen if she defied him. So she stayed motionless, her eyes locked on the floor as though refusing to witness what was unfolding might somehow make it less real. The apartment fell into a chilling silence afterward, the kind that presses down on everything like a weight. The television continued to flicker, but its noise felt distant and hollow. Lily's small body lay still, her life stolen in a burst of rage that lasted only minutes but changed everything forever. Ryan stood over her, his breathing heavy, his face hard and cold. He wasn't shaken or panicked. Instead, he carried himself with a frightening calm. As though what had just happened was nothing more than an inconvenience, Nicole couldn't bring herself to move. The image of her daughter would never leave her, but in that moment, she forced her mind to detach, to retreat into numbness. She wanted to scream, to collapse, but she did nothing. She allowed Ryan to take control, as he always did. He told her what they would say, how they would act, what story they would tell. His words came quick, commanding, certain. The plan was simple in his eyes. Lily hadn't been harmed inside the apartment. She had disappeared. She had wandered off, slipped away into the night. The truth was too ugly to expose, so it would be buried beneath a lie. Nicole nodded, barely able to speak, her silence sealing the pact. As the hours stretched on, the reality of what had happened began to sink into the walls, into the very air of that home. The toys left scattered on the bedroom floor would never be played with again. The crayon drawings on the fridge would never have new companions. A small life had been cut short, and in its place stood a void filled with fear, deception, and the terrible weight of complicity. The night was over, but the horror it unleashed was only just beginning. The morning after Lily's death, the apartment looked strangely ordinary, but nothing about it was the same. Ryan moved with a disturbing sense of control, already dictating the story that Nicole would repeat. He insisted they tell everyone that Lily had slipped out during the night, that when Nicole woke up, her daughter was gone. To make it believable, he ordered her to scatter a few belongings, to leave the front door unlocked, to act as if panic had just set in. Nicole, numb and hollow, obeyed every word. Fear gripped her more tightly than grief, and she convinced herself that following his lead was the only way to survive. When the call to authorities went out, the response was immediate. Police cars lined the quiet street, their flashing lights drawing neighbors from their homes. Search teams fanned out, scouring the nearby woods, the playground, and every corner of the community. Flyers were printed within hours, Lily's smiling face plastered across storefronts and pinned to bulletin boards. To the outside world, Nicole appeared to be a heartbroken mother desperate to find her missing child. She wept on command, clutched at Ryan's arm, and repeated the same lines he had drilled into her. At first, people believed her. Friends offered comfort, neighbors brought food, and volunteers spent long hours walking through fields in the sweltering heat. Strangers prayed for Lily's safe return. But beneath the surface of sympathy, doubts began to grow. Nicole's tears seemed rehearsed, and her words carried the rhythm of a script rather than the rawness of a grieving parent. Observers couldn't help but notice that Ryan stayed unnervingly close, often speaking for her, often watching her with a sharpness that made investigators uneasy. Detectives assigned to the case quickly picked up on the inconsistencies. Nicole claimed she had locked the door before bed, yet no signs of forced entry were found. She said Lily had a habit of wandering, but teachers and caregivers described her as cautious and attached. The timeline didn't line up either. Neighbors recalled hearing loud thuds and shouting that very night, noises that Nicole dismissed as the television. Piece by piece, the polished version of events began to unravel. The first real break came during the search of the apartment. Investigators found a child's blanket shoved deep into the trash can, damp and stained in a way that suggested hurried cleaning. On the bathroom floor, faint traces of blood had seeped into the grout, almost invisible to the naked eye but impossible to hide under forensic testing. The evidence didn't point to a missing child, it pointed to violence inside the very home where Nicole claimed Lily had vanished. As questions mounted, Nicole's facade started to crack. Her voice shook during interviews, her rehearsed lines slipping as detectives pressed harder. Ryan, on the other hand, maintained a cold confidence, deflecting suspicion with calculated calm. But the community that had once rallied behind Nicole was beginning to whisper. The story they had been fed no longer made sense, and the truth, though unspoken, was becoming impossible to deny. The search that began with hope was transforming into something far darker. The posters of Lily's smiling face no longer represented a child waiting to be found. They were a haunting reminder of what had been taken and of the lies that were collapsing under the weight of scrutiny. Nicole and Ryan were taken into custody within days of the evidence surfacing. The shift from being treated as a grieving mother to being questioned as a suspect was abrupt and merciless. At first, Nicole tried to cling to the story Ryan had forced on her, but the cracks widened with every interrogation. Detectives noticed how her answers faltered, how her gaze fell to the table whenever Lily's name was spoken. It wasn't long before the weight of what had happened crushed her defenses. The truth spilled out in fragments, and the story of Lily's final night emerged piece by piece in chilling detail. The courtroom became the stage where every hidden truth was laid bare. Prosecutors painted a devastating picture of a child failed by the very person meant to protect her. Photographs of bruises, reports from teachers, testimonies from neighbors, all of it combined into an overwhelming case. Ryan was portrayed as the aggressor, violent and manipulative, but Nicole was not spared judgment. The narrative turned against her as well. A mother who had chosen fear and desire over the safety of her daughter, a mother who had stood by in silence when action was needed most. The trial gripped the town. Reporters filled the benches, broadcasting each detail to an audience horrified by what they heard. People who had once brought casseroles to Nicole's doorstep now shook their heads in disgust. Lily's name became a constant refrain, her absence a shadow that hung over every proceeding. When the jury watched the footage of Nicole's first police interviews, her stiff body language, her hollow voice, the betrayal felt almost personal. Ryan faced the harshest sentence. Tried as an adult despite his age, he was found guilty of murder and handed decades behind bars. His calm demeanor in court unnerved everyone, as though he refused to acknowledge the magnitude of what he had done. Nicole's outcome shocked many. She received a lighter sentence than expected, her defense team arguing she had been trapped by fear and manipulated into submission. Some sympathized, claiming she had been another victim of Ryan's control. Others saw her reduced punishment as an injustice, a failure to hold her accountable for the role she played. After the trial, the small town struggled to heal. Lily's grave became a place of mourning, covered with stuffed animals, flowers, and handwritten notes from strangers who wished they could have protected her. Each birthday that passed was marked by vigils, candles flickering in the dark as the community whispered her name. Parents held their children a little tighter, reminded of how easily red flags can be overlooked when people are too afraid or too trusting to act. For those who had known Nicole and Lily, the grief never truly lifted. They remembered the little girl who used to draw chalk pictures on the sidewalk, the laughter that once echoed down the street, the innocence that was stolen in a single night of silence. The story left behind was one of betrayal and loss, a reminder of how fragile safety can be when love is confused with control, and how one child's suffering went unseen until it was too late.